The annual tournament played in Montilla in Spain is called the wine tournament because it's sponsored by the local wine growers, and it's invariably a very strong tournament. They always have a lot of grandmasters, and in 1976, the year I played, there were a total of 10 players, 6 of whom were grandmasters. The main attraction, from the spectator's point of view, was the participation of Karpov, who had just come from one of his few setbacks in tournaments. He had played in a double round match, in a double round tournament, I beg your pardon, in Manila, in which he had failed to win. It had been won by the Filipino player Torre. So we were all very interested to see how Karpov would react to this, for him, setback. He won the tournament very convincingly. His games were, in general, very long. He played with great technical precision, without doing anything spectacular. He also seemed to be playing well within himself. I've chosen a couple of examples of Karpov's play to show you, and let's start with a really typical Karpovian game, very, very subtle one. I won't give the whole game, it was very, very long, but I'll give you the starting from the initial position to a position which was fairly clearly won. This was a game he played in the first round as black against the Spanish grandmaster Pomar. The game actually started an hour late because Karpov was rather ill that day. One of the local fish had got at the inside of his stomach, and he wasn't feeling very well at all. However, it wasn't noticeable in his play. Set the pieces up in initial position. Pomar as white played knight to king's bishop 3. Black replied knight to king's bishop 3. White pawn to queen 4. Black pawn to king 3. White pawn to bishop 4. Black pawn to queen's knight 3. This is the Queen's Indian defence, which is very much a favourite of Karpov's, and he plays it very, very well. White pawn to king's knight 3. Bishop to knight 2. And white bishop to knight 2. Black bishop to king 2. White castles. Black castles. White knight to bishop 3. This is the standard starting position for the Queen's Indian defence, and Karpov played the normal theoretical move, knight to king 5. White replied queen to bishop 2. Rather quiet but very, very solid continuation, which is very, very difficult to win against. Black played knight takes knight. Queen takes knight. And now black hit at the centre with pawn to queen's bishop 4. White continued to develop his position logically by fianchetting his queen's bishop with pawn to knight 3. Black now played bishop to king's bishop 3, which sets up a pin on this black diagonal. The pin, it looks fairly harmless because white is well developed, but in fact as the game progresses, Karpov plays on this pin time and time again. It's a very nagging pin, and he manages to extract a great deal from it. Well, white continued bishop to knight 2. Black played pawn takes pawn. White naturally recaptured, knight takes pawn. The bishops were traded. Black bishop takes bishop. White recapturing, king takes bishop. And now black played a very simple move, pawn to queen 4. In many of these very simple positions, pawn to queen 4 is dangerous for black because it weakens his bishop 3 square, or queen's bishop 3 square that is, and white can often penetrate with a knight to that square later on. But black can get away with it because he has this annoying pin on the long diagonal. Well, white replied queen's rook to queen 1. He doesn't want to play pawn takes pawn because black would simply reply queen takes pawn check with quite a nice looking position. Now if you look at this position, it might seem that white stands a little better because he's certainly better developed. But again, Karpov played very simple moves, but very, very accurate ones, and got a very good position. He played pawn takes pawn. White recapturing queen takes pawn. And now a very subtle move, typical of these Queen's Indian positions. Switch off and see if you can find it. Black played queen to bishop 1. A very nice little move because it threatens to give white a rather nasty weak pawn by trading queens. And if white moves his queen away, black can give a check on knight 2 and develop his knight with a very nice looking position. So white traded queens. Queen takes queen. And rook takes queen, of course. Now if you look at the position, black still has this pin. The knight's now pinned to the bishop. And there's no easy way to break the pin. It's quite annoying. So white decided on an aggressive means of breaking the pin. He started advancing in the centre. Pawn to king 4. Black got on with his development. Knight to rook 3. Now white played pawn to bishop 4, so as to break the pin with pawn to king 5. Black replied knight to knight 5. White played pawn to king 5, and the black bishop came back to king 2. Well, white has solved his problem on the diagonal, but now he's got other problems, because his queen's rook's pawn's hanging, and also the black knight is threatening to do all sorts of damage. It's threatening to come to queen 4 and then hop into king 6, or maybe black is threatening at some point to penetrate on the queen's bishop file. So Pomar decided to introduce a pin of his own, bishop to rook 3. Karpov came with a very simple reply, bishop to bishop 1, breaking the pin. And now he has a threat. He threatens to move his knight back to queen 4. And when white replies bishop takes bishop, he can throw in knight to king 6 check, which will win the exchange. So white felt compelled to take the knight before it did any damage. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop. Now, almost imperceptibly, white's game has become quite difficult. His problem now is the queen's bishop file, because he cannot contest it. If he plays rook to bishop 1, black can just reply bishop to rook 6, and he must get control of the file. So instead, white decided to try and play actively with pawn to king's knight 4. He wants to play pawn to bishop 5 and activate his pieces. Karpov replied rook to bishop 4. And Pomar got on with the job with pawn to bishop 5. Now this appears to lose a pawn. So have a look at the position, switch off, and see what you think. Does it really lose a pawn? Well, if black takes the pawn immediately, with rook takes pawn, white can reply pawn takes pawn. Black plays pawn takes pawn, and now there comes knight to bishop 6, attacking both the rook and the bishop. And now where does the rook go? Well, if it goes to king 5 to defend the bishop, white simply plays king to bishop 3, and the rook has nowhere to go. So black has lost a piece or more. So put the black rook back on queen's bishop 4, black pawn back on king's bishop 2, white king back on knight 2, white pawns on king's bishop 5 and king 5, and the white knight back on queen 4. You see, black can't take this pawn immediately, but he can first play pawn takes pawn. And now, if white recaptures with the pawn, black can play rook takes pawn in this position, because after knight to bishop 6, rook to king 5, white king to bishop 3, black has to move queen's rook to king 1, which defends everything, except that it leaves his queen's rook's pawn hanging. White takes his pawn back, knight takes pawn. But now black can simply play bishop to bishop 4. And he has very, very strong threats in this position. The main threat is rook to king 6 check, followed by lots of other embarrassing checks, and white knight is very badly out of play. This position is very serious for white. So, go back again. Put the black rook back on rook 1, the other rook on queen's bishop 4, bishop on knight 5, and a pawn on queen's rook 2, and another pawn on king 3. And the white pieces, king on knight 2, pawn on king's knight 4, king's bishop 4, king 5, and queen 4. White played pawn to bishop 5, and black replied pawn takes pawn. Well, we've just seen white can't play pawn takes pawn, and if he recaptures with the rook instead, rook takes pawn, black simply plays pawn to knight 3, and after the rook goes away, he can take the king pawn. So white recaptured on bishop 5 with the knight. This way, he still loses his king pawn, but he gets a lot of counterplay. Karpov, of course, took the pawn, rook takes pawn, and there came the reply, rook to queen 7. Now black can't kick the white knight out immediately with pawn to knight 3 because of knight rook 6 check, of course. So he prepared this by first retreating the bishop to bishop 1. White took this opportunity to seize the other open file with rook to queen's bishop 1. Now came pawn to knight 3. The knight went back to knight 3. And now black has to do something about the threat of doubling rooks on the 7th rank. So he stuck his bishop in the way. Bishop to bishop 4. Now there came the clever move, pawn to queen's knight 4. Switch off and consider what you would play next with black. Well, if you're greedy, you would have taken the pawn, and white would have doubled his rooks on the 7th rank, had rook to bishop 7, and you would have had terrible difficulties winning that position. Instead, Karpov found the neat little move, rook to king 2. This forces the exchange of rooks. Rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, and now black has no technical problems at all because the white queen's knight pawn really is hanging now, so white has no time to penetrate the 7th rank with his rook. Well, the rest of the game is very long, went on for 92 moves, and I won't bore you with the whole game, but suffice it to say that Karpov won this position very efficiently. Karpov won 5 games in this tournament. 4 of them were very long, protracted affairs, rather like the game against Pomar. But the 5th win was one in which he really did mow down the opposition. And if you turn to if you set up the pieces in diagram 1, you will see the position which he reached as black against the Spanish player Fraguela, who was the back marker in the tournament. Surprisingly enough, in this game, it started as a symmetrical English, with Karpov having somewhat the worst of it. But he managed to reach this position without any difficulty at all. It obviously looks quite nice for black, but when you start looking at it more deeply, you realise just how good it is for black. In particular, the white knight on Queen's Knight 5 looks very proud and dominating, but it's got nothing to do with the game whatsoever, and white could just as well take it off the board. It's white's move in this position, and he played pawn takes king's pawn, which was recaptured. Knight takes pawn. And now, to avoid being lumbered with an isolated king's pawn, he played pawn takes pawn again, which was again met by knight takes pawn. And now the point of white's manoeuvres, he wants to get a piece to queen 5, so he played knight to bishop 4. Now switch off and consider this position. What would you play with black here? Karpov found a very deep move whose motivation is not immediately obvious. Nothing spectacular. Bishop to king's rook 3. Well, if you don't see the point of this move, switch off and have another look. His idea is that he wants to bring a knight to king 6, so that, for instance, when the white knight moves, as it did, white played knight to queen 5, he simply replied bishop takes bishop, white recaptured queen takes bishop, and now he took the knight, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop check, king to knight 2. And if you look at this position, you'll see that suddenly white is in a lot of trouble. And it's a good indication of Karpov's vision, that he saw that, well, he must have seen this position when he played bishop to rook 3. The position when he played bishop to rook 3 looked complicated. Now it looks very, very good for black. Well, white's next move was a mistake. He played bishop to king 4. No prizes for black's next move. Knight to king 6. takes rook by white. The only move to avoid losing the exchange. Black calmly recaptured. Rook takes rook. And now again, white only has one move. Rook to king 1. Well, what do you play with black here? Well, if you would have played queen to bishop 2, you would have won immediately. But the Karpov move was queen to rook 6, which also wins immediately, because he has two threats here. The first threat is obvious. He's threatening to bring the knight on king 4 to knight 5. And the second threat is a little less obvious, but very pretty. You see it? He threatens rook to bishop 7. And if the rook is taken, it's mate in 2. If you have another look at the position, you'll see that white has no chance of stopping either of these threats, because if either of his major pieces leave the back rank, he's mated by queen to bishop 8 check. So white resigned. A very convincing win. Well, two examples of Karpov's play, rather like a Swiss watch, very precise, but it never goes up in flames. There was some fireworks in this tournament. The best example came in the game between Diez del Corral and Fraguela from the position given in diagram 2. So if you set that position up on your board, it's white to move, and this is the game that won the Brilliancy Prize. Well, bearing that in mind, have a look and see if you can find white's move in this position. It's white to play. He played bishop takes pawn. For players who know the King's Indian attack, or who play the King's Indian attack, this is quite a well-known sort of sacrifice, but it's nevertheless quite pretty. Black must take the piece, pawn takes bishop, and now if you didn't find bishop takes pawn, have another look at the position and see what you'd play here. Pawn to king 6. Black has to take this pawn because it threatens to rip through his position. So pawn takes pawn, and white recaptures with the rook. Rook takes pawn. The point of white's sacrifice is that if black moves his queen, white simply replies rook takes rook check, and then queen takes pawn check, and he wins everything, because, well, apart from anything else, the black bishop is hanging. So he has to give up his queen. Queen takes rook, knight takes queen, rook takes knight, and now white queen takes queen's pawn. This attacks a whole variety of pieces. Amazingly enough, black has one move which defends them all. It's difficult to spot. Knight to rook 2. If he hadn't had that move, white might never have won the brilliancy prize. Well, what do you play next with white? Nothing very difficult. Rook to king 1. Bring the last piece into play. Forces the reply king to bishop 2. Now rook takes rook, rook takes rook. And see if you can find white's next move. Quite a subtle one. Well, in these positions, quiet moves are usually best. And this quiet move is queen to queen 4, which threatens the knight, threatens a nasty check on knight 7, and also the queen's knight's pawn for those who like grabbing pawns. Black decided he had to get some counterplay, so rook to king 8 check, king to rook 2, and bishop to bishop 3, threatening his own little mate. Well, what do you play here with white? The move is pawn to king's bishop 3, blocking up the white diagonal. Black cannot take the pawn because of queen to bishop 4 check, winning the bishop. So instead, he started to throw some of his wildly scattered pieces into the attack. Knight to knight 4. White replied by giving a check on knight 7, and the black king comes to king 3. And now, a very simple move, queen takes pawn, rook's pawn of course. And black, bishop takes pawn, threatening mate again. Well, have another study and see what you come up with. Corral came up with queen takes pawn check, not a difficult move to find, king to king 2, another check on knight 5, black king to king 1, and knight to bishop 2, stopping the mate. Well, with the queen's rook's pawn, with the king's rook pawn about to queen in 2 moves, black has to do something. So knight to king 4, white pawn to rook 7, and now black knight to knight 5 check. What do you play here? Not difficult. No marks for knight takes knight, but 10 out of 10 for queen takes knight. And black resigned, because after bishop takes queen, he queens his pawn with check and wins everything. A very nice combination. One of the players whom one might have expected to give Karpov a run for his money in this tournament was Robert Byrne, the American Grandmaster, who did so well in the interzonal, in the last World Championship cycle, the one which Karpov won. However, he wasn't in particularly good form in this tournament, and he only won 1 game. But the 1 game he did win was a very classy affair and is well worth giving. This is the game in which Byrne had white against Pommard, and it started pawn to queen's bishop 4. That's an unusual move for Byrne, who likes to play pawn to king 4, but he's had problems in the past with Pommard's Caro-Kann. Pommard's a very tenacious defensive player, and the Caro-Kann in the hands of a tenacious defensive player is very, very difficult to break down. A very hedgehoggy sort of defence. So Byrne decided he wanted to play something different. Pommard opted for a Queen's Indian defence, or Nimzo Indian defence, with knight to king's bishop 3. White played knight to queen's bishop 3, black pawn to king 3, white pawn to queen 4, black bishop to knight 5. And now a slightly unusual system from white, knight to bishop 3, and also a slightly unusual move from black, castles, which is, in my opinion, not the most accurate move. He should probably fianchetto his queen's bishop with pawn to knight 3 and keep the option of castling queenside, because white can now inflict a rather nasty pin, bishop to knight 5. Black pawn to king's rook 3, bishop to rook 4. The trouble with this pin is that black can never break it without weakening his kingside quite a lot, with pawn to king's knight 4. Black decided on pawn to queen 3, white pawn to king 3, black queen's knight to queen 2. A fairly standard sort of Queen's Indian, Nimzo Indian position, with the one difference that black has castled. White obviously wants to develop his king's bishop now, but where would you develop it? On king 2 or queen 3? Have a think about it. The right answer is king 2, because black's plan is to play pawn to king 4 and later pawn to king 5. And if you put your bishop on queen 3, you're liable to lose it, or have to lose a tempo to avoid losing it. So Byrne played bishop to king 2, black replied pawn to king 4, and now he was able to castle, white was able to castle without any problems. And now Pommard decided it was high time he took the knight before the knight ran away. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and black played rook to king 1. He wants to bring his knight round to bishop 1 and knight 3, so as to break the nasty pin. Have a look at the position and see what you'll play with white here. Nothing spectacular. White played knight to queen 2. A very common move in these sort of positions. with lots of ideas in mind. One idea is to bring the knight to knight 3 and play pawn to bishop 5. Another idea is to play pawn to king's bishop 4. And another idea is to play pawn to king's bishop 3 and pawn to king 4. On king's bishop 3 the knight gets in the way, and on queen 2 it supports everything. Black got on with his plan, knight to bishop 1. And now white played quite a subtle move, knight to king 4. It's subtle because it puts the black knights on the wrong route. Black wants to bring his knight to knight 3, but here he's faced with the prospect of getting his pawns doubled, which he doesn't want at all. And if he reacts violently with pawn to king's knight 4, white doesn't play any flashy sacrifices. He just replies knight takes knight check, and then retreats the bishop, and next move he plays pawn to king's bishop 4, and black's position gets busted wide open. So instead, black had to play knight on bishop 1 to rook 2. Again met by a quiet move, pawn to bishop 3, which prepares to retreat his bishop. Black now played bishop to bishop 4, which forces the white knight to come to a decision, which the knight duly did. It exchanged itself off. Knight takes knight check, knight takes knight, and now white has gained the tempo for pawn to king 4, which he played. Black now has to decide which way to retreat his bishop, and he decided on rook 2, bishop to rook 2, but this has the disadvantage that as likely as not the bishop will never be seen again, because the white pawns effectively hold it out of play. Switch off and study this position and see what you'll play next with white. He played a very thematic move, very strong one as well. Pawn to bishop 5. This attacks the base of the black pawn chain, and black dare not allow white to resolve his double pawns by pawn takes queen's pawn. So he was forced to play queen's pawn takes pawn, to which white replied queen's pawn takes bishop's pawn. And now black played queen to king 2. The white pawns on the queen side are not really as weak as they look, because white has opened up lines for his bishops and also has the queen's knight file. Also the fact that the black bishop on rook 2 is stuck out of play is very important in this position, because with the queen side opening up, black's really going to miss that bishop. Switch off and see if you can find white's next move here. The obvious one is bishop to bishop 2 to defend his pawn, but Burns saw no necessity to do this. He simply played queen to knight 3. Here Pommard replied instantly with queen takes pawn check. After the game, Byrne told me that he was staggered by this move. Obviously he'd seen it, but he simply thought it was unplayable, and he felt that instead black ought to have played pawn to queen's knight 3, in which case he would certainly not have captured pawn takes knight's pawn, because this opens the queen's rook file for black, who can recapture with the rook's pawn, and without his front queen's bishop's pawn, white's position doesn't look very impressive. Instead, Byrne would have played bishop back to bishop 2, because white is quite willing to sacrifice a pawn in order to double black's queenside pawns, because then he can get his two bishops really working and can penetrate on the queen's knight file. However, go back, put the white bishop on rook 4 and the black pawn back. Black did play queen takes pawn check, and Byrne replied bishop to bishop 2. Now black is unable to hold his queen's knight's pawn, because if queen to bishop 3, white has bishop to knight 5, winning the exchange. So he had to retreat his queen to king 2. White naturally took his pawn back. Queen takes knight's pawn. And now white has a beautiful position. His strategy has completely succeeded. He's got two beautiful bishops pointing at the queen side, and black is still this almost half a piece down, because his bishop on rook 2 is completely out of play. So Pommard took the best practical decision. He went for counterplay. He played knight to rook 4, threatening to come to bishop 5, which white obviously stopped with pawn to knight 3. And now he gave up a pawn with queen's rook to knight 1. White took the pawn, queen takes pawn, and black penetrated to the 7th rank with his rook to knight 7. White now played bishop to bishop 4, and black continued to increase the pressure with queen to bishop 3. White now defended his king's bishop pawn, bishop to king 3. Now switch off and see what you would play for black in this position. He played knight to bishop 5. White cannot take the pawn takes knight, because it's mate in 2. Queen to knight 3 check, and on the next move, queen to knight 7 mate. So, switch off again, and see what you would play with for white here, instead of pawn takes knight. Byrne played a very greedy move. Queen takes another pawn. Queen takes bishop pawn. Because what's black threatening here? He's got a check on rook 6, but nothing more. Well, black didn't take the check. The knight is best placed where it is. He played his other rook to queen's knight 1, king's rook to queen's knight 1, hoping to introduce another piece into the attack. Now switch off again and see what you would play for white here. Byrne found a clever counter-sacrifice. Queen takes pawn check. Queen takes queen, it's forced. Bishop takes queen check. King takes bishop. Pawn takes knight. And don't be fooled here by the bishops opposite colours thing. Black's bishop on rook 2 is still out of play, and white has got 2 extra pawns. And bishops opposite colours endings are only drawn when the opposite bishop is working. In this position it's not working at all, and Byrne won this position rather easily with white. After 4 games between foreigners, you might be asking yourself, how did this fellow Stean get on? The answer is not too bad. He got a Grandmaster norm, and he had some quite exciting games. If you set up your pieces in the position on diagram 3, you'll see one of his exciting games, or a position which precipitated one of his exciting games. This is the position I had as black against Spanish player Pomar, and it was my move, black to move. Have a look at this position and see what you would play for black. I played pawn to queen 4 here, which is a natural looking move, but it requires a lot of calculation. White must reply pawn takes pawn. And now, what do you play in this position with black? Well, you can of course recapture knight takes pawn, but black has a much more interesting move, knight on bishop 4 to king 5. If you didn't see this possibility, switch off and have a rethink about the position. White only has one move here, knight to bishop 6, breaking the pin on the bishop file. Black replies knight takes knight. White must play queen takes knight. And now have another look at the position. The obvious move for black here is knight takes pawn, which seems to attack everything, but it also loses everything. White replies rook takes knight, and after pawn takes rook, knight takes bishop check, queen takes knight, queen takes rook. And when you count up the dead bodies at the end, you find that white has a bishop more. So let's go back. Put the white queen back on bishop 3. give him a rook on queen 1, a knight on bishop 6, and a pawn on queen 5. And for black, a pawn on king 3, a queen on knight 2, a rook on queen's bishop 1, a bishop on king 2, and a knight on bishop 3. In this position, I played the move I prepared, bishop to rook 6. Count yourself a good player if you saw this move coming, because my opponent didn't, not at all. When you look at the position, you'll realise that white has to lose some material now, because black really is threatening knight takes pawn. White doesn't have this rook takes knight resource anymore, and his rook's also attacked, and he can't do anything in the middle. For instance, if white here tries pawn takes pawn, black plays bishop takes rook, white pawn to king 7, and now black simply replies bishop takes bishop, white pawn takes rook equals something big check, and now black king takes whatever it is, and again when you look at the position you find that black must come out a piece up. So put the pieces back, black king on knight 1, rook on king's bishop 1, pawn on king 3, bishop on rook 6, and for white, a rook on queen's bishop 1, a bishop on king 3, and a pawn on queen 5. Karpov found the best continuation for white now, which is to give up the exchange. He must give up something, with pawn to queen 6. Black replied bishop takes rook, and white played rook takes bishop. And now black knight to queen 4. It looks as if black's winning this position, but it's not so easy. White replied queen to bishop 4. Now switch off and study this position. The obvious move for black here is to take the bishop. Knight takes bishop. White has not got time to flick in knight to king 7 check and take the rook, because there's a mate threat on knight 2 when the white knight moves. So white has to recapture pawn takes knight. On the other hand, knight to king 7 check really is a threat now, so black has to put his king in the corner, king to rook 1. And white plays pawn to king 4. When you look at this position, you'll see that white can't move any of his pieces. His knight is pinned, and the two pieces behind it are forced to stay where they are in order to keep the knight protected. On the other hand, black can't move any of his pieces either. and white threatens simply to prop up his passed pawn with pawn to king 5, and then play pawn to queen's knight 4 and pawn to queen's knight 5, propping up his knight. And in the meantime, it's difficult to see what black can do about it. I studied this position for some time and decided that there wasn't really much to do with black here. So I rejected that idea. So put the black king back on knight 1 and give him his knight back on queen 4. Put the white pawn on king 4 back to bishop 2 and give him his bishop on king 3. Having the exchange more, I naturally wanted to try and win this position, so I played queen to queen 2, threatening to pick up the queen pawn. And I was rather surprised by my opponent's reply. Switch off and see if you can find it. He played bishop to queen 2. Now, the idea for white is to play pawn to king 4 and pawn to king 5. If black plays pawn to king's bishop 4 here to stop it, white simply replies bishop to bishop 4. Black cannot take the bishop because white can flick in the knight to king 7 check move and take the rook. So after bishop to bishop 4, black has to hide his king in the corner, king to rook 1, and now white plants his bishop on king 5. And it's difficult to see how black can ever break this white stranglehold. So put the black pieces back, king on knight 1, and the king's bishop pawn back to king's bishop 2, and the white bishop back to queen 2. I played queen takes pawn in this position, and white replied pawn to king 4. If you saw queen takes pawn, but hadn't prepared a reply to pawn to king 4, switch off and try and find one. If you want to play knight to bishop 3 here, then you're going to run yourself into trouble, because white doesn't reply pawn to king 5, he replies bishop to knight 4. Now where do you put your queen? Well, the answer is you don't really, because the queen hasn't got any good squares, and if it had any good squares, white can always reply knight to king 7 check. So instead you have to play rook takes knight. White bishop takes queen. Black rook takes queen. White rook takes queen. And black has a lot of problems in this endgame, because white's going to bring his rook to queen's knight 4, or queen's bishop 6, and black's into grave danger of losing all his queenside pawns. So go back. White rook on queen's bishop 1, queen on bishop 4, bishop on queen 2, and knight on bishop 6, black queen on queen 3, rook on queen's bishop 1, and knight on queen 4. The move I played was quite a pretty one. Instead of knight to bishop 3, I played knight to bishop 6. A move which may take you by surprise. It's a classic interference move. White wants to bring his bishop to knight 4, but needs to keep his pieces doubled on the queen's bishop file to defend the knight. And the bishop 6 square is the point of intersection of these two lines. So by putting a piece there, I cut him up. White has to reply queen takes knight, and now comes rook takes knight, and in this position we agree to draw, because after queen takes rook, black queen takes bishop, white can do nothing except attack the black queen with rook to bishop 2. The queen goes to queen 8, and again white can do nothing except attack the black queen again with rook to bishop 1, and the queen comes back, and we have a draw by repetition. So, an entertaining struggle. First I thought I was winning, then I thought I might be losing, and eventually it was a draw. Everybody has at least one slice of luck in a tournament, so I'll be brave enough to show you mine. Set the position up at diagram 4, and you'll see a rather exciting stage of my game with white against Spanish Grandmaster Diez del Corral. It's white to move in this position, and things are quite complicated, so switch off and have a good look at the position. The thing to watch in this position is black's counterplay on the queen's bishop file. For instance, if you try and preserve your attacking bishop with bishop to knight 1, black replies bishop to knight 6, and white's getting in a bit of trouble here. So, putting the bishops back, I decided to slow down black's counterplay on the bishop file by playing bishop takes knight, which avoids a bishop exchange and leaves the black rooks sitting behind the bishop on bishop 5, which is doing nothing. There's also a rather deep point behind the move bishop takes knight. It's a very surprising looking move, and see if you can see what this point is. My idea was that after the natural reply rook's pawn takes bishop, the white knight retreats to bishop 4, and black plays bishop to knight 6. The idea is simply to give up the exchange with pawn to rook 5. Black takes the rook, bishop takes rook, white recaptures. Black's best try is now to trade off some rooks. Rook to bishop 8, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, check. White king to knight 2. And when you look at the position now, you'll find that there's no way to defend the black position. The queen and 2 knights simply deliver mate. For instance, if black plays pawn takes pawn, white replies queen takes pawn. And there's no way to stop the white queen coming in. So, go back. White queen on knight 4, pawn on king's rook 4, rooks on king 1 and queen 1, and a bishop on knight 6, and a knight on rook 5, black rooks on, and the king back on knight 1. Black rooks double on the bishop file, on bishop 1 and bishop 2, and his bishop on bishop 5, and the king's rook's pawn on king's rook 2. Having seen that recapturing with the rook's pawn loses to knight to bishop 4, process of elimination showed black that he could only recapture with the bishop's pawn. Bishop's pawn takes bishop, and white replied knight to bishop 4, which produces rather an overkill attack on black's king pawn. However, things aren't so clear, because black replied bishop to knight 6. Now switch off and have a long think. The position is full of hidden possibilities. Well, firstly, if you just decide to defend your rook with, say, rook to queen 2, black replies rook to bishop 8. White has to swap. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook, check. King to knight 2. And now black throws his last piece in, knight to bishop 5. And where does white's silly rook go? Well, it can't go to king 2, because of bishop to queen 8, and if it goes to queen 3, black plays bishop to bishop 7, rook to king's bishop 3, or queen's bishop 3, doesn't matter. Black plays bishop to bishop 4, which is very embarrassing. So, put the pieces back. Black bishop on knight 6, knight on rook 4, rooks on queen's bishop 1 and queen's bishop 2, white rooks on king 1 and queen 1, and the king back on knight 1. And once you discover that white can't play the obvious move rook to queen 2, you see that the position isn't so simple. I thought I must be winning here, So I looked around for something complicated and came up with queen takes pawn check. Which is a mistake. Can you see why? It's very difficult. Well, first of all, black must reply queen takes queen, and white plays knight on knight 5 takes queen. Now switch off and see what you play with black. Firstly, bishop takes rook is no good. White simply plays knight takes rook, and he comes out with at least one pawn more. The second possibility, which may have sprung to mind, is rook to bishop 7. Well, we'll come back to that because that's what was played. But the third possibility, whose strength I'd completely underestimated, was rook to bishop 3. The point being that if white moves his rook to queen 3, or anywhere else for that matter, black simply replies pawn to king's rook 3. And now white can move neither of his knights, ever. And black can simply come and round them up with king to bishop 2. And rook takes knight next move. I didn't see this idea, unfortunately nor did my opponent. But Karpov, as hawk-eyed as ever, had finished his own game that day, and he pointed this out to me after the game. It rather took me by surprise. In fact, if you put the white rook back on queen 1 and the black pawn back on king's rook 2, that is retracting the last two moves, white would have to give up the exchange here with knight to knight 5. Black replies bishop takes rook, rook takes bishop, black rook to bishop 8, rook takes rook, rook takes rook check, king to knight 2. And if you care to examine this position, white is a whole exchange down for only a pawn, but his knights and passed king pawn are so strong that he can almost certainly draw this position. So in fact, my mistake wouldn't have cost a whole point, only half a point. However, going back to the position that occurred in the game, put the black rooks back on bishop 1 and bishop 2, his bishop on knight 6, white rooks on king 1 and queen 1, the knight on knight 5 on king 6, and the white king back to knight 1. As I said before, in this position black played rook to bishop 7, which is the only move I really seriously considered in this position, and indeed the only move my opponent really seriously considered in this position. I played knight to queen 3 to defend the queen's knight's pawn. But one also has to calculate very carefully in order to be able to play knight to queen 3. Can you see why? Well, black apparently has the strong reply rook on bishop 7 back to bishop 3. I'd seen the rook to bishop 3 idea in this position. Can you see how white replies? His rook is attacked and his knight is attacked. He replies rook to queen's bishop 1, because black cannot take the knight without losing his own rook, and obviously an exchange of rooks won't help him. But he can play bishop to bishop 7. Again attacking two knights. But the knights can defend each other by the knight from king 6 retreating to bishop 4. Black then has an apparently very strong move, knight to knight 6. But don't panic, white can get out with knight to knight 4. A mind-boggling sort of move, but when you begin to work things out, you'll find that white comes out on top every time. Or at least I did anyway. So, let's go back again. Black knight back on rook 4, bishop on knight 6, and rook on queen's bishop 7, white knights on king 6 and bishop 4, and rooks on king 1 and queen 1. White played knight to queen 3. Here black replied knight to bishop 3. My next move was rook to bishop 1 to exchange off the active rook. And only now did black conceive of the idea of trying to trap my knights. He played pawn to king's rook 3. But it's too late now. I played rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, knight on queen 3 to bishop 4. Black bishop back to bishop 4. This threatens king to bishop 2, winning a piece. But white has very simple reply. Rook to queen's bishop 1. Now king to bishop 2 is impossible, because of the reply rook takes knight, and white has a knight fork on queen 8. Well, he obviously cannot allow an exchange of rooks by knight to king 2, so he played king to rook 2 for lack of any other constructive moves. White played pawn to king's bishop 3, threatening pawn to king's knight 4, and it's all over. Black is a pawn down, and he must lose another sooner or later. And moreover, he's got to allow an exchange of rooks sometime, because his knight's in this semi-pin on the queen's bishop file. In fact, he played the desperation pawn to king's knight 4, and after pawn takes pawn, he resigned.
Well, those last two examples by Mike Stean were certainly too good to be left to moulder in the pages of a magazine. Audio Chess now offers, besides the pre-recorded cassettes, also cassettes recorded, private tuition by almost any master in the country, and there's also a library service, so you can hire the cassettes for something like twopence a day, and don't need to lash out a few pounds on them. Another type of cassette which we'll be developing very shortly is the how good is your chess type. That is, you go through a game and you're asked to switch off every move, work out your move, and maybe write it down on a piece of paper. After this, you'll be given points for the move you selected. You can add them all up at the end and then decide whether you're a grandmaster, grand rabbit, or whatever. And you can also send them up to results, that is, up to Audio Chess to be certified and stamped, and then you'll get a sort of Audio Chess grading.